The hall was drafty even in summer. Thick stones had a way of trapping cold that refused to vanish, and the dais at the far end was draped in tapestries worn by decades of smoke and shifting light. King Roderick sat upon the high seat, a man of middle years whose hair had gone gray at the temples more from worry than from the natural course of time. His royal robes were trimmed in thread of gold, though the garment itself was patched along the inner sleeves in places where the velvet had frayed. A single silver pin, shaped like an eagle's claw clutching a black pearl, held his cloak over his shoulders. He looked every bit a king with his back straight and his chin held high, yet there was a tremor in his left hand that he could not steady no matter how tightly he clenched his fist. Before him stood 3 envoys from the Iron Bank, travelers who had arrived 2 days prior with a letter that many rumored contained dire threats or demands. The men from the bank wore severe expressions, faces carved of stone. Each carried a ledger beneath an arm and a slender dagger at the hip, symbolic, some said, of the Iron Bank's willingness to fight for its gold if persuasion and contracts proved insufficient. Roderick was no fool. He understood the significance of their arrival. For 3 generations, his family had borrowed heavily to fund the wars that shaped the realm, to build the roads and fortresses that allowed House Kalistar to remain supreme over the western shores. Now the interest had mounted beyond measure. Rumors whispered that the crown had not sent a repayment to Bravos in over a year, that the ports no longer shipped the precious cargo from which taxes were gleaned, and that the Royal Mint had slowed in production after the mines in the Snowpeak Mountains collapsed during the last harsh winter. Taxes had been levied multiple times upon the small folk and lords alike, and the harvest yields had dwindled under the burden. Hunger and resentment simmered in the kingdom. Half of Roderick's vassals were scowling behind his back, muttering about his mismanagement, though none dared defy the crown openly yet. The Iron Bank had sent repeated warnings, each more strongly worded than the last. Now, the presence of these envoys in the king's hall signaled a final ultimatum. Roderick's voice was low as he addressed them, trying to maintain dignity. He did not rise from his seat but beckoned them closer. They stopped a few strides away, each bowing curtly. One of them, a man named Orland, spoke. He had a taut face with deep-set eyes and black hair slicked with fragrant oil. "Your Grace," he said, voice carrying surprisingly well in the gloom. "We have traveled with pressing business on behalf of the Iron Bank. The terms of your debt are known to you. Repayment has been absent for many months. We have come to request a final arrangement and to inform you of consequences should the crown choose to default yet again." Roderick set his jaw, inhaling slowly. "You speak as though we have chosen to break faith," he said, the tremor in his hand becoming a subtle spasm. He willed it to still. "Perhaps you believe we have not tried to repay? You know well the conditions on our coasts. The reavers to the north decimated half of our shipping. A sickness ravaged the southern fields. We are no strangers to adversity, but House Kalistar has always repaid its debts to your esteemed institution. Always. We only ask for patience as we rebuild." Orland's companions, 2 men who might have been cousins, both with equally somber countenances, exchanged a glance. Orland pressed on. "We understand the hardships, Your Grace, and we have extended leniency in the past. But the sums involved have grown beyond the scope of what can be reasonably deferred without." His next words were drowned out by an echoing cough that tore from Roderick's throat. For a moment, the king's pallor grew waxy. Then he inhaled carefully and forced the cough away, waving a dismissive hand. "Continue," he managed. Orland inclined his head in a mock gesture of sympathy. "We cannot simply wait forever, Your Grace. The Iron Bank has decided that either you settle an acceptable portion of the principal and commit to a realistic schedule of repayment, or the Iron Bank will be forced to assert its right to recoup losses. We are prepared to offer terms that may be more amenable, if you can show good faith." He lifted the ledger under his arm. "But if good faith is absent, the Iron Bank must protect its interests in other ways." At the edge of Roderick's peripheral vision stood his master of coin, a small, stout man named Andric who was as cunning as he was short in stature. Andric's face had fallen into a grim set, and Roderick recalled their hushed conversations by candlelight. The treasury was empty, the crown's capacity for immediate repayment non-existent. Taxes on the small folk could not be raised again without risking open revolt. The lords had grown hostile to new demands. The king's only remaining hope for a significant sum was locked behind certain trade agreements with far-flung allies who had yet to sign the treaties. More likely, that wealth would not come in time, if it ever came at all. Roderick spoke, trying to salvage the situation. I will not pretend that the sums are small. I also will not pretend that the kingdom's fortunes have been fair as of late. But my word is bond, as was my father's, and his father's before him. Give me a year of respite, and I will see that your bank is paid a sum that ensures you do not lose faith in our bond. Orland was silent for a moment, fingertips drumming the spine of the ledger in his arms. The hush in the great hall was absolute. Finally, he let out a small sigh that seemed to carry far more weight than the air it displaced. We are authorized to grant no more than a season's extension, he said carefully. We request an immediate gesture of good faith, 10,000 golden royals by the new moon, and we will stretch your next interest payment 3 more months beyond that date. If you cannot provide it, we will be forced to take other measures. The sum was enormous under the current circumstances. 10,000 gold royals would have been a trivial matter when the Silverbluff mines were still abundant and the Crown's shipping lanes were safe. Now it was a staggering demand. Roderick felt the edge of despair in his chest, but he forced himself to project outward calm. We will do all we can, he said. The envoys bowed. We await your response by the new moon, your grace. They departed the hall with measured footsteps that left the hush intact. Only when the heavy doors had closed did Roderick let out his breath. He signaled for Andric to follow him, and they left the dais by a side door to speak in private in the antechamber. The king's feet dragged. His mind was already swirling with desperate calculations. In the antechamber, tapestries of hunting scenes lined the walls. A single lantern provided illumination, casting flickering light over Roderick's fatigued features. His master of coin stepped closer, voice hushed. Your grace, we cannot conjure such sums. The crown's coffers are nearly bare. The lords are slow to pay what they owe. If we press them, many will rebel. We must consider alternative routes, loans from other foreign banks, or coin from the southern principalities. Perhaps we could marry your daughter, the Princess Lydia, to the heir of the merchant prince in Terex Bay. They might provide a dowry that covers part of it. Roderick closed his eyes, leaning against a side table. Lydia is only 14. I had hoped, he trailed off. Hope had become a luxury. I had hoped to see her grown and wed to someone of her choosing. But if the realm depends on it, so be it. Still, I doubt we could procure that much coin before the new moon. The ships alone, the time, it's too short. Andric was silent. They both understood the gravity. The Iron Bank was known for collecting on debts one way or another. From the time Roderick had been a child, he had heard stories of the bank secretly backing a rival claimant whenever a king defaulted. Armies rose overnight, suspiciously well-funded, sweeping away dynasties that had become a liability. The refrain repeated by Bravosi emissaries was known throughout the world. The Iron Bank will have its due. Andric's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and calculation. We could attempt to pledge certain crown jewels, the regalia, the precious antiques in the Great Vault. But to raise 10,000 gold royals in a month? We'd have to empty the entire vault, and still it might not suffice. And the next round of demands will follow in 3 months, at which point we'd have nothing left. Roderick listened, a dull ache forming behind his eyes. His father, King Torin, had borrowed fortunes to fund expansions that never fully came to fruition. Those expansions had left him with a legacy of half-built roads, half-finished towers, all of it worthless without more coin. Now Roderick was left picking up the pieces, scapegoated by circumstances that outran any single man's ability to fix them. He let out a long, shuddering breath. We will try. Whatever can be raised or sold, do it. Offer the best interest we can to other lenders. Pray that someone invests, perhaps the merchant prince. Perhaps the Summer Isles. Anyone. We need relief, or the Iron Bank will foreclose on the crown. Andric nodded, though hope in his eyes was dim. I will do what I can, your grace. They parted ways, each man's steps weighed by knowledge of how precarious their position had become. At the top of a winding stair, the king paused at a high window to stare into the courtyard below. He could see a group of knights practicing spear drills under the watchful eye of the master-at-arms. The clang of steel was faint at this height. Servants bustled, carrying sacks of flour from wagons to the storerooms. A few stable boys sprinted around corners, chasing one another with giddy shouts. The ordinary life of the castle continued, oblivious to the crisis overshadowing them all. Roderick turned away from the window. The illusions of normalcy were fleeting. In his mind, the shadow of war or insurrection loomed. If the Iron Bank turned to a rival claimant, who among his cousins or second cousins might be enticed to make a grab for the throne? He thought of old genealogical lines, half-forgotten claims. The House of Calistar had its share of black sheep. Disgruntled dukes who believed they deserved more, extended branches who believed themselves more rightful heirs, upstart bastards or exiled noblemen. The realm was rife with potential betrayers, and the Iron Bank had pockets deep enough to buy swords from all corners of the known world. He pressed onward, each footstep resonating as though it were the knell of an inevitable doom. Days passed in anxious flurry. Throughout the capital city of Loven, the king's agents scrambled to levy old debts from vassals, to shake coin from the reluctant wealthy. Messengers departed in every direction, seeking foreign lenders, alliances, trade deals. Whispers filled the taverns and the wharves. Whispers said the king was desperate, that the Iron Bank's envoys had threatened dire consequences if the gold was not found. Some insisted the monarchy was on the brink of collapse. Others scoffed that House Calistar was too formidable to be undone by bankers. But as the new moon approached, the gloom in the city thickened. In private, Roderick began to weigh the possibility he might have to flee with his family if an uprising started. He hated himself for the thought, yet survival demanded contingency. The royal guard were under orders to prepare for any possibility. Within the castle's walls, a certain tension coiled among the corridors. Servants whispered that the king had grown pale and coughed into his kerchief at night. The stress had taken a toll on him, physically and spiritually. Finally, the dreaded day arrived. The new moon soared dark in the sky, and the envoys from Bravos insisted on meeting with the king again. They arrived at the great hall. Torches burned low, flickering against the stone. Courtiers stood in uneasy silence as Orland and his two companions waited expectantly. Roderick appeared on the dais, flanked by Andric and a small retinue of knights. His posture was stiff, his face drawn. He attempted a regal air, though the shadows beneath his eyes betrayed him. After a moment of tense quiet, Orland spoke. "Your Grace, has the crown prepared its payment?" Andric stepped forward. He held a heavy purse in both hands, the leather bulging. He placed it before Orland on a small table. The sound of coins shifting inside was audible. "This is—" Andric cleared his throat. "This is 7,000 royals in gold coin. We have also brought additional valuables." He gestured, and two knights carried forth a small chest wrought with silver scrollwork. Within it lay crown jewels, some from the time of Roderick's grandfather. A necklace studded with rubies, a scepter of silver with an emerald tip, an ancient ring set with a black opal. "We estimate the combined worth to be the sum you requested, or very close to it." Orland's expression did not soften. He lifted the purse, feeling its weight, then inspected the chest. One of his companions stepped up to examine the jewels, carefully appraising them with a practiced eye. The hush in the hall grew suffocating. Finally, the appraiser nodded to Orland. Orland inclined his head. "We shall consider these goods as partial settlement. Should the overall appraised value indeed meet the sum we demanded, the Iron Bank will accept this as your gesture of good faith, though I see it is supplemented by precious metals rather than the full gold coin. We note that it took great effort, no doubt." The slightest shade of condescension tinted his voice. Roderick forced a small nod of acknowledgement. "You have your sum, then?" "Yes." Orland's gaze flicked momentarily to the king. "And we remind your grace that a significantly larger repayment will be due within 3 months for the next portion of interest." Should that fail, we will have no choice but to take steps in accordance with our rights." The formal words had a sharp edge. The Iron Bank had not been appeased, merely delayed. Everyone in the hall understood that nothing had been solved, only postponed. Roderick inhaled through his nose. "We will continue our efforts." That was all he could say. He did not add that they had all but emptied the treasury and parted with ancestral regalia to meet this demand. Another blow like that and the crown would be in complete financial ruin. As it was, their ability to maintain the army or feed the city's poor was compromised. The envoys departed once more, leaving an atmosphere of dread in their wake. Roderick disbanded the court for the day, retreating to his private quarters where he collapsed into a chair, head in hands. He felt the press of time more heavily than ever. All the while, unknown to the king, the Iron Bank's wheels of alternative plans had already been set in motion. Orland and his companions had arrived with more than an ultimatum. They had come with instructions to survey the realm, weigh potential allies, and gauge the influence of possible usurpers. The moment they reached the capital, they began discreet inquiries, speaking in coded references to traveling merchants, ship captains, and lesser nobles who might lead them to a disaffected claimant. It did not take long for them to discover rumors of Lord Edric Montblay, a distant cousin of King Roderick's line, who had once openly boasted that he had a better claim through an elder branch that had been unfairly disinherited. Montblay was not known to be popular among the people, but he had some loyal bannermen, and more importantly, he was rumored to be cunning and ruthless. The bank's agents also had their eye on Lord Jonah Pierce, an older man from the eastern reaches with a rumored claim, though far more tenuous, and an appetite for gold that far exceeded his existing coffers. There were half a dozen more who might be shaped into figureheads. The Iron Bank was not too picky. They needed an aristocrat with enough of a blood tie to House Calistar to rally discontents. The bank did not want a rebellion of peasants or a foreign invader. They wanted the pretense of legitimacy to keep the realm stable once the dust settled, ensuring a prompt return on investment. It was in a smoky back room of a modest inn near the harbor that Orland first met with the agents of Lord Edric Montblay. The conversation was cloaked in secrecy, but the words were dangerously direct. Yes, Montblay might be open to new alliances, said a middle-aged knight named Ser Gavin who wore Montblay's crest. But would the Iron Bank truly support an open revolt? Montblay would not move against the king unless he was certain that significant funding and influence lay behind him. Orland sipped his wine and gave a slow smile. The Iron Bank, as you know, invests wisely. We do not speak lightly of such matters. But if your lord were able to promise that the new regime would honor the crown's debt and repay the bank what is owed under more favorable conditions, there could be an agreement beneficial to all, particularly to Lord Montblay. Ser Gavin rubbed at his chin. Montblay has not forgotten the slight done to his line. He claims it was his ancestor who was passed over for the throne. If King Roderick's branch had not manipulated the Great Council 3 generations ago, the Montblays would be wearing the crown today. But we would need swords, a great many swords, to stand against the royal army. We would also need the support of other lords, the ones that have grown resentful or fearful of Roderick's bankrupt rule. And we would need gold to hire sellswords, to purchase arms and feed the men. Where would such gold come from, if I may be so bold? Orland's smile did not waver. The Iron Bank has deep vaults. From that point on, in the hush of small, concealed gatherings, negotiations progressed quickly. Montblay's circle demanded a staggering sum of coin to finance their ambitions. Orland and his associates asked in return for signed contracts ensuring that if Montblay were crowned, he would repay the crown's debt to the bank on an accelerated schedule once he secured the realm. Montblay's men balked at the idea, but Orland had an answer for everything. Upon seizing the throne, Montblay could raise new taxes on Roderick's loyal lords, confiscate the property of those who resisted him, and perhaps reopen the Silverbluff mines with new labor. There were countless ways to find the coin, if one was bold and had the Iron Bank's backing. Ser Gavin expressed a final concern. What of the common folk? Will they accept Montblay? King Roderick still has some measure of goodwill among them. Despite the hardships, they remember the feats of his father, the expansions that gave them roads and trade for many years. Orland's companion, a quiet man named Rosario, leaned forward. The small folk care for peace and security. They grow weary under famine and rising taxes. If your lord can present himself as the savior of the realm's finances, someone who can restore prosperity because he has the gold to do it, they will follow. We can arrange shipments of grain from overseas to distribute in Montblay's name. Bread and hope can turn the tide of favor quickly, especially in the starving winter. It took many nights of clandestine discussion. Edric Montblay himself came to the capital in secret once, disguised as a simple traveler, to meet personally with Orland in a private manor house near the city's outskirts. Montblay was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with a keen gaze and the bearing of a man accustomed to command. He had an aristocratic air that some might find arrogant. His once dark hair showed flecks of gray, and he wore a neatly trimmed beard. Montblay was as cunning as the rumors suggested, and he was hungry for what he saw as his rightful birthright. In that meeting, Orland laid it all bare. The Iron Bank was prepared to fund a campaign to unseat King Roderick if Montblay would sign an unbreakable contract ensuring full repayment with interest. Montblay read the thick parchment by lamplight, his eyes moving rapidly over the script. The terms were strict. Victory would catapult him to the throne, but the new king would be indebted to the Iron Bank for a generation. Montblay's lips thinned. He looked from the parchment to Orland's composed face. You speak as though you're offering me a gift, but I see the chain that comes with it. Orland inclined his head. All crowns are chains, my lord. Yet, the alternative is to remain a mere nobleman with no chance of fulfilling your family's rightful destiny. A risk, yes, but an opportunity too. Montblay weighed it. Ambition flared in his eyes. Very well, he said, taking up a quill. But know that I will not sign away my dignity. I will see these debts repaid in due time, but do not expect me to bend the knee to bravos like some vassal. We expect only the coin that is owed, Orland replied smoothly. However your grace, that is, your future grace, wishes to handle the realm is your prerogative. He slid a small dagger across the table. Montblay pricked his thumb and pressed a droplet of blood beside his signature. The red sealed the contract in a manner both symbolic and binding in the eyes of Braavosi law. Orland's own signature and seal followed. Under candlelight, the arrangement was sealed. They clasped hands in silence. The first shipments of gold arrived at Montblay's seat of power within weeks. Sacks of coin hidden in crates labeled as ornamental glass. Wagon after wagon escorted by hired men sworn to secrecy. From that moment, Montblay's allies began recruiting mercenaries, forging alliances with disgruntled minor lords who saw in Montblay a chance to dethrone Roderick. Messages were dispatched to the free companies in the east, offering double the standard rate if they would march under Montblay's banner. The best blacksmiths in the region were retained to forge new swords, spears, and armor. Quietly, the seeds of rebellion took root. King Roderick noticed that the roads carried fewer travelers, that some lords had grown unresponsive to his couriers. Vassals who once arrived promptly with their retinues at the capital now sent only letters full of vague excuses. The city's mood worsened as small folk discovered that bread and produce were scarcer. Harvests had come in poorly, and the crown did not have the funds to import grain. Taxes were still high. People muttered about the king's weakness, though many remained loyal out of habit and fear of change. Whispers of Montblay's name circulated, but few dared voice them too loudly. On a crisp autumn morning, 3 months after the Iron Bank's good faith deadline had been extended, the final interest payment came due again. This time, no gold was forthcoming from the crown. Roderick's envoys had been unable to secure the necessary sums, and so, the Iron Bank's envoys arrived in the capital with the face of stern inevitability. They presented their demands in the king's audience chamber, the same austere hall. Roderick looked older than his years, heavy circles under his eyes, the lines of worry carved into his brow. Andric stood beside him, glancing nervously at the visitors. Orland stepped forward, voice carrying throughout the chamber. Your Grace, the day is upon us. Do you have our gold? Roderick's throat constricted. We have managed to gather a portion, he began. Andric gestured, and a smaller bag of coins was brought forth, accompanied by a pitiful array of lesser jewels. "We can offer these with our renewed pledge that the balance will be—" Orland cut him off, his tone crisp. "We will not accept partial measures any longer. We demanded the interest. That interest is now due in full. Failing that, the Iron Bank declares your loan in default. We have come to inform your grace that we will pursue other means to collect what we are owed. The king's word is not worth the ink upon the parchment, it seems." A hush fell. Courtiers drew in sharp breaths. Roderick felt fury and shame roil in his gut. But what could he do? He had no means to conjure gold from thin air. He opened his mouth to protest, but Orland shook his head. "It is done, your grace. Henceforth we view your crown as insolvent. We take no pleasure in such matters, but you should know, the Iron Bank will have its due." Without another word, Orland and his associates turned on their heels and departed. Roderick let out a ragged breath, the color draining from his face. He felt a chill creep into his limbs, as though the ghost of doom had brushed past him in that moment. Days later, the news arrived. Lord Edric Montblay had declared King Roderick's rule illegitimate and proclaimed himself the rightful heir to the throne of Calistar. He called upon all loyal men to join him in restoring the realm to prosperity, claiming that he had secured resources from foreign backers who believed in his cause. He called Roderick a puppet king of a bankrupt monarchy, a man who had sold the kingdom's future to pay for his father's follies. Montblay's banner, a silver griffin rampant on a field of green, was raised. In the same breath, letters were distributed through the realm inviting the smaller lords to side with Montblay. Enclosed in those letters was a promise. For those who joined promptly, Montblay would forgive all existing royal taxes for 5 years once he took the throne. He also promised that the region's battered economy would be restored with generous loans from his overseas partners. It was a potent bribe. Roderick's council was in disarray, half in disbelief that Montblay would dare such open treason, the other half quickly concluding that Montblay must have the Iron Bank at his back. Alarm bells rang in the capital. The king's generals began mustering the royal army. Yet the coffers were empty, meaning the crown struggled to equip new recruits or even feed existing soldiers properly. The sense of crisis deepened. Meanwhile, Montblay's forces assembled with astonishing speed. Mercenary companies from the east arrived by ship, unloading at coastal towns that had quietly pledged themselves to Montblay's cause. Bravosi gold paid their wages. Roving companies of sellswords began marching inland. Montblay's loyal vassals in the southwestern territories pledged him their knights and foot soldiers. Day by day, peasants from the outlying regions flocked to Montblay's camps, enticed by the offer of wages or perhaps out of desperation for bread. Some had grown disenchanted with Roderick's rule, believing Montblay's claims that he could fix the realm's finances. Montblay distributed sacks of flour and salted fish in newly secured towns, winning the favor of the hungry smallfolk. It was not long before Montblay's banners loomed near the first strongholds that had declared for the crown. The fortress at Bridgefort was among them, situated at a strategic crossing over the Rill River. Montblay's men encircled it with surprising efficiency. Under the leadership of Ser Gavin, the fortress fell in under a fortnight. The sight of Montblay's newly forged battering rams, paid for by Iron Bank gold, sent Bridgefort's defenders into panic. Soon the green field with the silver griffin flew above the ramparts. The tide was turning. King Roderick's letters of condemnation arrived in Montblay's camp too late. "You will be named traitor," they read, "and your name will be stricken from every record of honor. In the name of the Seven, stand down." Montblay laughed when he read them. In a sign of brazen defiance, he used the royal seal to light a torch. He told his men that King Roderick was a cornered animal, lashing out in vain. The mercenaries roared their approval. In the capital, Leuven, the king's council frantically prepared. They had perhaps 3 or 4 months until Montblay's approach, if not sooner. The royal army still outnumbered Montblay's men, on paper. Many lords, especially in the northern half of the realm, remained loyal or fearful of defying the throne. But the crown was short on money, The morale in the capital was low, and Montblay's successes seemed to mount with each passing week. Roderick ordered more musters. He recalled troops from the southern borders, leaving those areas exposed to raiders, which caused further discontent. The roads were jammed with peasants fleeing the possibility of war. The city swelled with refugees seeking protection, straining Loven's resources. Bread riots broke out in certain districts. Cries of "Where is the king's gold?" rang through the streets. The city watch struggled to contain the chaos. Rumors spread that Montblay's men would soon appear with wagons of food, liberating the populace from a starving capital. Disquiet grew. Still, there were loyalists, old lords who had fought with Roderick's father, who balked at the idea of a usurper. They gathered what forces they could. Letters were exchanged with foreign allies. Yet no outside kingdom wished to entangle itself in a civil war, especially not one financed by the Iron Bank. The bank's reach was long, and few dared oppose its financial might. Roderick's pleas fell on polite but non-committal ears. By late autumn, Montblay's armies had taken 3 more lesser strongholds and begun a cautious march toward the capital. Word arrived that Montblay had established a base of operations in the fortress city of Brinewatch, where the inhabitants welcomed him. He used the city's port to ferry in additional mercenaries. The usurper's forces now included a formidable cavalry wing, heavy infantry, and siege engineers. Montblay, flush with coin, paid them all generously and on time, building an aura of confidence among his troops. Roderick arranged his own forces outside Loven. He appointed his cousin Lord Damien as overall commander, a veteran soldier who had led campaigns in the northern mountains. Damien was capable but faced a bleak situation. The ranks of the royal army were poorly supplied and half-starved in places. The king could not afford the wages to attract enough mercenaries of his own. Even some of Roderick's knights were grumbling about the lack of rations. In desperation, Roderick had minted new coins of questionable metal purity. The royal mint took old copper coins, plated them with a thin layer of gold or silver. It was a final attempt to conjure currency from nowhere, but the deception did not last. Rumors spread quickly that the king was issuing fool's coin, worthless outside the capital. The markets rebelled, demanding real gold or no trade. The crown's desperation only fueled Montblay's propaganda. "See how the king defrauds his own people? My gold is true Bravosi coin. Follow me, and you will be rewarded with real wealth." Roderick spent sleepless nights pacing in the royal solar. He had never intended to be a warmonger, but now war was upon him. In quiet moments, he thought of abdicating rather than leading thousands to their deaths. But he knew Montblay was not the type to forgive his foes easily. Roderick's family, including young Princess Lydia, would likely be at risk if Montblay took power by force. The wheel was turning unstoppable. He had to fight. Early winter set in, blanketing the realm in cold rains and frosts that turned muddy roads to half-frozen quagmires. Montblay's approach slowed, but he continued inexorably forward, capturing more towns and forging alliances with local lords who saw the writing on the wall. Some of the lesser nobles who had once supported Roderick shifted their allegiance rather than be destroyed. Montblay rewarded them with promises and a share of the spoils once the war ended. King Roderick's domain seemed to shrink daily. At last, the first major pitched battle occurred on the plains south of Loven. Montblay's vanguard, led by Ser Gavin, encountered a portion of the royal army commanded by Lord Damien. Reports later dubbed it the Battle of Moorfield. The ground was slick with winter sleet, each step a treacherous slide. Both sides fielded around 10,000 men each, though Montblay's mercenaries had better equipment thanks to Bravosi gold. Lord Damien was a shrewd commander and used the terrain to his advantage, forcing Ser Gavin's cavalry into boggy ground where they struggled to maneuver. For a time, it seemed the royal forces held the upper hand, pinning the vanguard and threatening to envelop it. Then Montblay arrived in person with reinforcements. Fresh columns of Sellswords poured in on the flank, men armed with pikes and crossbows of superior craftsmanship. Their disciplined advance shattered Damien's lines. Morale among the royal troops gave way to panic once they realized the enemy's numbers were greater than anticipated. The result was a bloody rout. Hundreds of loyal soldiers were slaughtered in the retreat, their bodies left half-submerged in the muddy fields. Lord Damien rallied what forces he could and fell back toward Loven, but the damage was done. Montblay had shown his potency on the battlefield. Word of the defeat reached the capital days later, along with streams of ragged survivors. King Roderick heard from Damien himself that they could not hold the countryside much longer. Montblay's army, now swollen to over 15,000, was a short march away from the capital's walls. Behind closed doors, the king's advisors urged him to consider negotiating a peace or even surrender. Roderick stared at them with bleak eyes. "Have you forgotten that Montblay claims the crown by right? He has made no secret that he intends to depose me and likely punish those who stood against him. There is no honorable peace to be found in submission." He paused, remembering his daughter. "We will defend Loven. We have strong walls, enough supplies for a siege, at least for some months." But even that plan held a grim outlook. The city was overcrowded. Tension and riots could boil over. Could the capital's walls truly withstand Montblay's siege engines? The Iron Bank's gold had allowed Montblay to hire the best engineers and buy the most advanced siege equipment. He might attempt a direct assault or else starve them out. For the time being, Roderick ordered every able-bodied man to help fortify the city. He prayed for a miracle. Montblay, however, understood the city's strengths and weaknesses. He advanced methodically, capturing outlying villages, cutting off supply lines. He placed archers and cavalry at key roads, intercepting any attempt to bring provisions into Loven. By the time he reached the capital's outskirts, the noose was all but tied. His banners darkened the horizon like a storm. Tents sprouted around Loven, forming a ring of steel. In the city, the watchers on the walls estimated that Montblay's host numbered at least 20,000 now, including local levies who had joined. Montblay wasted little time beginning siege preparations. He erected trebuchets with formidable throwing arms, built covered rams, and stationed crossbowmen to harass anyone appearing on the battlements. The city responded by releasing flights of arrows and boiling pitch, but the scale of the attackers was daunting. King Roderick stood on the ramparts, chilled by the winter wind. From there, he could see Montblay's war camp in the distance, a sea of tents bearing that silver griffin on green. Braavosi coin had turned Montblay's ambitions into an army that overshadowed the capital. Roderick's breath plumed in white clouds as he gazed upon it. At dawn the next day, Montblay's messengers rode up to the city gates, calling for parley. Roderick's guards dragged a battered footbridge across the moat, allowing a small party to approach. Montblay himself sat astride a proud black destrier, clad in plate armor with gold filigree, courtesy of the Iron Bank's funds. The sun glinted off his visor. Around him, a retinue of knights displayed the Griffin banner. Montblay removed his helm, revealing short-cropped dark hair flecked with gray, and a face that radiated confidence. The king stood atop the gatehouse, flanked by Damien and a small cadre of archers. Roderick's breath caught in his throat as he peered down at the usurper. Montblay called up, voice booming with practiced authority. "King Roderick, you have lost. Your walls may hold for a short time, but your cause is doomed. Surrender the city, and I promise clemency to all but your most treacherous advisors. You and your family will be allowed to live in honorable exile in some distant holding, if you bend the knee and acknowledge my rightful claim. Do otherwise, and your city will burn, your people will starve, and your line will be extinguished." Silence stretched. On the walls, archers shifted, waiting for the king's signal to loose. But Roderick held up a hand, cautioning them to wait. He ground his teeth, torn between pride, duty, and a glimmer of self-preservation. Montblay's words carried a certain inevitability. Could the city truly withstand a siege by an army so well supplied? Roderick squared his shoulders. "Lord Montblay, you speak of rightful claims, yet my father and grandfather ruled this land with the blessing of the realm. Your so-called claim is born of envy, financed by the Iron Bank's gold. If the day ever comes that we yield, know that history will name you a traitor and a usurper." Montblay's lip curled, History is written by those who triumph, King Roderick. He let the title hang mockingly. You have until sundown tomorrow to open your gates. After that, my engineers will commence the assault. I will not offer mercy a second time. With that, Montblay turned his horse, and his entourage cantered away, leaving the king's men seething on the walls. Roderick exhaled slowly, feeling Damien's eyes upon him. "Summon my council," he said. "We will decide our next move." They met in the half-lit war room, the smell of wax candles and old maps saturating the air. The conversation was tense. Some advocated an immediate attempt at negotiation, hoping Montblay might grant better terms than total surrender if they met him halfway. Others demanded they fight to the bitter end, at least attempt to hold out until an unforeseen ally intervened or Montblay's funds ran short. But the Iron Bank's coffers were deep, and Montblay could presumably maintain a siege for many months. Meanwhile, Leuven was overcrowded and on the brink of food riots. Ultimately, Roderick decided to stand firm, if only because Montblay's terms guaranteed the end of House Calistar as a ruling dynasty. Exile was little better than a death sentence for everything Roderick had sworn to uphold. If Montblay's threat was real, the best they could do was to hope Montblay's men might falter, or that Montblay himself might make a costly mistake in the assault. Also, a small part of the king still clung to the notion that some foreign power or internal rebellion against Montblay might yet come to his aid, though such hope was faint. Night fell, bringing bitter cold. Torches glowed atop the walls. The city's defenders huddled in cloaks, keeping watch for the first sign of movement in the enemy camp. Within the gloom, Montblay's war machines stood ominously silent. Dawn's gray light revealed them in stark outline. The calm before the storm weighed on every soul within Leuven's walls. It was mid-morning when the siege truly began. Montblay's trebuchets hurled massive stones that crashed into the walls and towers, sending rubble spraying. The defenders' RESP ondayed with their own catapults, but the city had only a few, and their ammunition was limited. Great arcs of flame soared across the field as Montblay's men launched pots of burning tar, setting parts of the outer battlements ablaze. Archers on both sides exchanged deadly volleys. The clash of steel on shields, the screams of wounded men, echoed off the stone. Day after day, the bombardment continued, gradually wearing down sections of Leuven's outer defenses. Montblay's infantry probed for weak points, though each time they attempted a direct assault, the defenders rained arrows and poured hot pitch on them, forcing them back. Casualties mounted on both sides. The city's inhabitants cowered in cellars as bits of rubble fell from overhead. The royal guard tried to maintain order, but the supply of grain and clean water ran dangerously low. In private, Roderick's health deteriorated further. The constant cough returned, and a fever burned in his veins. Yet he pushed himself to appear on the ramparts, encouraging the defenders, refusing to show weakness. If they saw their king falter, morale might collapse entirely. During the second week of the siege, Montblay's engineers unveiled a monstrous battering ram covered by an iron-tipped enclosure. They advanced it toward the main gate in a slow creep, shielded by crossbowmen who picked off the city's archers whenever they exposed themselves. The defenders hurled stones, fired flaming arrows, even attempted to roll burning logs down from the gatehouse. Montblay's men extinguished those flames with water wagons prepared in advance. Finally, with deafening thuds, the ram smashed against the gate repeatedly. The thick oak began to splinter, piece by piece. Inside the city, a sense of impending doom reached a fever pitch. Citizens fled deeper into the inner wards, or else scrambled to the gatehouse in a desperate attempt to hold the line. The king's personal guard, clad in battered plate, formed a shield wall at the gate's threshold. When the gate gave way with a thunderous crack, Montblay's men surged in, face to face with Roderick's last line of defense. For a time, the fighting was savage. The narrow opening prevented Montblay's larger force from pouring in all at once, allowing the defenders to hold them off in a frantic melee. Swords clashed, shields shattered, and the screams of dying men mixed with the acrid stench of burning pitch. By evening, Montblay ordered a tactical withdrawal to avoid heavy losses from the choke point. He would wait, bombard more, open multiple breaches. The respite for the city was brief. That same night, chaos erupted in the southwestern quarter of Leuven. A group of Montblay's sympathizers within the walls, perhaps unscrupulous merchants or lesser lords who had been bribed, rose up, opening a postern gate to let a contingent of Montblay's soldiers slip inside. Suddenly, the city defenders found themselves fighting not only at the main gate but in the winding streets. Alarm bells rang out, citizens screamed, buildings caught fire as the invaders clashed with loyalists. The king's guard rushed to contain the breach. In the swirling confusion, rods of flame lit the night sky. The southwestern quarter was lost in a tide of steel. Panic swept the populace. Some tried to flee to the palace. Others surrendered on the spot to the invaders, hoping for mercy. By dawn, the southwestern quarter was firmly in Montblay's control, but Roderick's men had blocked the main thoroughfares leading to the palace district. Still, it was only a matter of time. Montblay's army outside renewed their pressure on the broken main gate, while the occupying force inside threatened to open more gates. The city defenders were overwhelmed by the dual threat. Smoke rose from multiple fires, turning the pale morning light into a crimson haze. The final stand came at midday near the palace complex. The king's loyal knights barricaded the avenues, forming defensive lines as Montblay's banners approached from both directions. Street by street, the defenders were forced back. Despite brave resistance from Lord Damien's cavalry, the superior numbers and better-fed troops of Montblay ground them down. Montblay himself rode at the head of a column of knights. His armor bore streaks of soot and blood, his eyes fierce with the certainty of victory. In the courtyard outside the palace gates, the battered remnants of Roderick's guard assembled, perhaps 400 men. Montblay's host outnumbered them at least 5-1. Arrows hissed overhead, lodging in the courtyard walls. Lord Damien, wounded in the shoulder, addressed his king. "Your Grace, we cannot hold them much longer. We must get you to safety." Roderick coughed into a blood-stained kerchief, feeling the weight of his sword like an anvil. He saw the fear in the eyes of his last loyal men. Fear but also determination. They would lay down their lives for him. Was it worth the sacrifice? He shuddered. "We'll make for the palace keep. Bar the doors. If Montblay has any shred of honor, he will accept our surrender to spare further bloodshed." But before they could move, Montblay's cavalry crashed through the palace gates, scattering defenders. Montblay's foot soldiers followed swiftly, raising their banners. Lord Damien shouted for a countercharge, leading a small group of knights who attempted to push back the invaders. Steel rang on steel in a deafening cacophony. Roderick found himself engulfed in the swirl of combat. Soldiers lunged at him, only to be beaten back by his personal guard. Another wave pressed in. The king swung his sword, catching a mercenary across the chest, but the exertion racked his coughing lungs. He stumbled, and a crossbow bolt grazed his shoulder. Blood dripped down his arm. He nearly collapsed but was hoisted upright by a loyal knight who dragged him back. When Lord Damien fell with a spear through his chest, the last vestige of organized resistance shattered. Montblay's men overwhelmed the courtyard, cornering the king's guard against the palace steps. Roderick's knights fought desperately, but they were cut down one by one under the relentless tide. Finally, only a handful remained, encircling the wounded king. Through a haze of pain, Roderick saw Montblay dismount. The usurper strode forward, sword in hand, flanked by a ring of crossbowmen whose bolts were leveled at Roderick's guard. Montblay lifted his visor, revealing eyes that burned with triumph. "Yield, Roderick," he said. "Spare yourself and those few who remain. The city is mine. The realm is mine. The Iron Bank stands with me. Your cause is lost." Roderick's breath came ragged. He cast a pained glance at the bodies of his men strewn about, the city behind them in flames. In the distance, he thought of Princess Lydia, hopefully hidden away in a safe chamber with her mother. He had fought to protect them, yet everything had come undone by the power of gold and a long-simmering ambition. His hand trembled around the sword hilt. The cough tore at his throat again, flecks of blood on his lips. He closed his eyes, swallowing the bitter taste of defeat. After a moment that felt eternal, he let the sword slip from his grip, the steel clattering onto the palace steps. "I yield," he managed, voice breaking. "Spare my family, for the sake of the realm." Montlay raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. The last loyal knights placed their weapons on the ground. Many sank to their knees, exhausted and heartbroken. An eerie hush spread across the courtyard, broken only by distant cries and the crackle of flames. Montblay's victory was complete. Within hours, Montblay's banner was hoisted above the palace. He declared himself King Edric Montblay, rightful ruler of Calistar. The battered city saw the enthronement that evening in a hastily organized ceremony. Loyal bannermen and Iron Bank representatives in attendance. Orland was among them, standing near the throne dais with a small, satisfied smile. The Iron Bank would have its due, indeed. Roderick and his remaining family were placed under guard. Montblay initially considered executing them to avoid future rebellions, but Orland quietly cautioned him that it was better to keep them alive, for appearance's sake, and in case the Iron Bank ever needed a bargaining tool. Montblay acquiesced, exiling Roderick's kin to a remote estate near the border under heavy surveillance. Roderick himself, too ill to travel far, remained in the palace's old tower, effectively a prisoner. Rumors suggested he would not last the winter, as his cough worsened daily. Over the following weeks, King Edric Montblay worked to consolidate his rule. He issued proclamations that the war was over, that prosperity would return under his guidance. Montblay made a public show of distributing bread and grain to the starving population, a gift from the new king. In truth, it was purchased with Bravosi gold. The small folk, exhausted by siege and hunger, accepted the new king with cautious relief. Montblay's men cracked down on looters and reopened the main roads. He promised to reduce taxes for a period, though he told his advisors privately that once things stabilized, he would need to raise substantial sums to repay the Iron Bank on schedule. Orland and his fellow Bravosi envoys made certain to remind Montblay of the contract's details. A series of payments would be due over the next decade. Montblay's success hinged on extracting wealth from the realm. He considered seizing all property belonging to lords who had died fighting for Roderick, redistributing it to new loyal vassals while skimming a portion for the crown. He also had his eye on re-establishing the mines in the Snowpeak Mountains, no matter the human cost. The realm, for the moment, lay quiet and broken. Many had died in the short but brutal civil war. The fields outside Loven were littered with scorched debris from siege engines, mass graves of soldier and civilian alike. Within the city, smoke still curled from ruined districts. But Montblay's banner flew high, a testament to how the Iron Bank had once again toppled a royal line that could not meet its debts. King Roderick's final days passed in fevered delirium, rumored to have died quietly in the same palace that had seen his coronation years before. Montblay did not publicly announce Roderick's death until it was certain, then stage-managed a small, unceremonious burial. In the aftermath, the lords who had hoped to remain neutral bent the knee to Montblay. The bank had proven unstoppable in its methods. Trade slowly resumed, as Montblay offered incentives to merchant houses that recognized his rule. The kingdom might yet recover at a cost. Bravosi moneylenders would haunt the treasury for years to come, but Montblay's position was secure enough that he believed he could manage them. And so a new era dawned. Yet, in hushed corners of taverns and around hearth fires in remote villages, tales spread of how King Roderick's downfall was orchestrated not merely by Montblay's ambition, but by the Iron Bank's calculating hand. Some declared that the real rulers of the world were not kings or queens, but those who held the wealth behind the scenes, pulling strings to ensure they would always be repaid. Others whispered that Montblay had made a devil's bargain, that one day the bank would call in a debt that even a king might not be able to pay. But for now, Montblay wore his new crown, the green banner flying triumphant over a battered kingdom. The small folk, desperate for normalcy, carried on with their daily struggles, uncertain whether the new order would prove better or worse than the old. In the sumptuous halls of the palace, Montblay dined with Bravosi envoys, forging new trade deals and negotiating interest rates. The Iron Bank had its due. A once proud dynasty lay in ruins, reminding all who witnessed it that when the crown fails to pay its debts, the cost can be the kingdom itself. And thus ended the reign of House Kalistar, undone by coin and ambition, replaced by a sovereign who owed his throne to the power of lenders far beyond the sea. The realm would learn, in the years to come, how deeply the Iron Bank's chains were wound around the new king's seat. Montblay would rule, but he would rule beneath the ever-watchful eyes of his creditors. For the man who banks on war is never truly free of the debts that made that war possible.